Hi everyone, my name is Leah Pappas. I'm a student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and today we're going to be talking about the really important topic of metadata, file management, and archiving. So I'm going to stick around for a little bit while people join in. Watch it. Yep. Awesome. Maybe I'll just look at yours. How's it looking? Sweet. Looks beautiful. Awesome. Welcome everyone. So again, my name is Leah, and we'll be talking about metadata, file management, and archiving today. And while we're waiting, I'd love to know a little bit more about who's watching. Where are you from? What language do you work on? What language do you speak? And also, have you ever just had any experience with metadata management? How did it go? Did you face any challenges? Lots of questions. Just let us know a little bit so we know who's in the video. Hello, Wasim from Pakistan. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, so just to share a little bit about my experience with metadata. I think it's the hardest part of language documentation, and you guys will learn why, but primarily because you have to do it immediately or you forget. And I'm really, really bad at doing it immediately. Always finding an excuse, and I always regret it. So, how's it going? How many do we have? Awesome. All right, we'll stick around for a few more minutes while we wait for people to come in. And if you're just joining us, let us know where you're joining in from, what language you speak, what language you work on. All right, we'll stick around for another minute, let everyone, stragglers, join in. Hi, Mercedes, welcome for joining us. Awesome that you have experience right now working with metadata. I'll be looking forward to hearing about your experience, how you've gone about this. I'll be sharing with you today our LDTC's way of working with things, but also some of the personal things I found to work. So I'd love to hear how your experience has compared and what you've done. Oh, awesome. Hi, Wasim, you're working on Dani? Great, so we have people from all over the world, Peru, Pakistan. It's great. Again, I'm looking forward to hearing what your experience has been. All right, should we get started? Okay, so we're gonna get started. We'll let people come on in as they come. Just to reiterate, my name is Leah Pappas. I'm a PhD student at the University of Hawaii, and I focus on language documentation in the Pacific. And today we're going to be talking about metadata, file management, and archiving. So 3 incredibly important topics. Also, what I believe are some of the hardest things to do in language documentation. And by the end of today, you should have some sort of workflow that you will be able to use whenever you're approaching language documentation work. Okay, and we'll also share a lot of materials with you as well if you want to use them to help keep your own stuff organized. All right. So the first topic we're actually going to cover today is what is a language archive. So we're covering the third one first. And it's really important to understand what a language archive is before going about the data management. So a language archive is an institution or a place that is meant to maintain your data basically forever. So you give your data to an archive, and they have people whose job it is to make sure that that data is safe. Okay. And this is really important because we want our data to last as long as possible, so that anyone in the future, any community members or outside members who are interested in that data, can access that data and learn about the language and the culture and the people who spoke it. And to successfully archive, it's really important to have proper data management up to that point, because you're giving your data to someone who's never seen your data. They're not in your mind. And so it's very difficult for them to approach new data if they don't know what's going on. Okay, so proper metadata management is super important for being able to archive your work at the end. Okay, and so archives are so important because I've certainly had this situation in my life, maybe you guys have as well, where you did a lot of work and then your computer broke and you couldn't get the data off of it, or you spilled something on your keyboard, or you got a virus and it deleted all of your data. And so this is a situation where you weren't able to keep your data safe. But by having an archive as a second place to put your data, it helps make sure that if you get a virus or if something happens to your computer, that data is still safe with people who are keeping, whose job it is to keep it safe. Okay. And it's also important to remember that all data is vulnerable, so maybe you want to archive in two archives, right? So many of you may have heard about the National Museum of Brazil burning last year, or in 2018, I guess it's 2020 now. And this was kind of exceptional, so archives don't usually burn down or have any issues, but it makes you think maybe it's worth archiving in several places so that your data is in several places, and if something happens, it's okay, it's somewhere else. Okay. So luckily, there's over 60 endangered languages archives in the world, and so no matter where you are in the world, you should be able to find an archive that's willing to archive your data. So I've listed here two links where you can get lists of archives. There's the linguisticsociety.org and then languagearchives.org. And you can go through these and see, kind of like shop around for an archive that works for you. There's different kinds of archives, and you might choose your archive based on your location. So for example, some of these example archives include Paradisic, which focuses on Australia and the Pacific, languages of Latin America, the Alaskan Native Language Archive, the Oral Resources of Africa. So several archives are based on certain regions. So if you work in Peru, then maybe you want to try archiving with the indigenous languages of Latin American archive. Or if you're in Africa, maybe Alora is worth it. But then there's also other archives that will just archive anything. So two examples here are the Endangered Languages Archive and Kaipulehone, which is the archive here at Hawaii. And if you ever want to archive anything with LDTC, then we archive with Kaipulehone. Okay, so it's just important to remember that the end goal of your archive, or the end goal of your data, should be an archive. Okay, now to get to that end goal, it's really important to have proper data management. Not just to make your life easier, but to make the archivist's life easier. Okay, and this is just a way to organize your work and be comprehensive so that it's easy to understand. And you can do this with file naming, folder structures, and metadata. And you should do this every single day. So you collect your data, and then you should immediately manage your data so that you don't forget anything. And this is because your data is valuable, and it really needs to be carefully labeled so that anyone who's looking at it, whether it's you in the future or someone else, they know what's inside, okay? And it's really, really important not to overestimate yourself. I always do this, and I think in the future I will remember, but my memory isn't great, and pretty much all of our memories are not great, and we will forget what happened yesterday or a week ago or a month or a year ago. So it's very important on the day of to make sure that you've managed your data properly. Okay. It's the most important part of documentation, because if you collect all of this data and you don't have a system for working with it, then it's useless. Yeah. So I have a question for you guys. Has anyone had the experience where you struggled to organize your data after waiting too long? If so, what happened? So I'll let the video catch up. And I can share my own experience if you guys want it, I'm sure. One day in particular that I remember where I really should have done better with my documenting was that I was recording several speakers, and I had an audio recorder and a video recorder, and my video recorder wasn't working. So I didn't have video for all of my files, but I had it for some. And then after the day ended, I decided to go to a wedding instead of managing my data. And then the next day, it was almost impossible to figure out what went with what. It took so long, and that still haunts me. So one of those examples, make sure that you're really keeping track of your data. Welcome from Manila. Awesome, we have more people in. So if you feel like sharing, let us know if you've had any struggles with data management, what has been your hang up that is making it difficult to stick with. Oh, thanks for sharing, Anna. Yeah, I do this too, where you don't necessarily write down who the participants are until too long, and by then you've forgotten. Yeah, I do that a lot. Good to hear I'm not alone. We all make our metadata mistakes. Yeah, so keep this in mind. If you want to share, please share your experiences. I'm going to keep going, and we can have some time afterwards to talk and ask questions. So at LDTC, we like to think of your data processing like coffee. And this is a great analogy, because if you've ever seen a coffee berry, it doesn't look anything like coffee. It doesn't taste like coffee, it doesn't smell like coffee. And you can't just drink coffee from a coffee berry. First, you have to dry it and roast it and grind it. And only after you've done all that can you enjoy your coffee. Okay? Similarly, the data that you collect on the day that you record something isn't useful. It doesn't have information attached to it. First, you have to process that data. You have to have metadata for that data. You have to rename it and archive it. And only after you've archived it can everybody enjoy that data. So think of the data that you collect on that day. That's not ready yet. It takes a lot of work to get to the point where it is ready to use. Okay, so last week you guys learned how to do recordings, video and audio recordings. And so I know Blake touched on this a little bit, recording your metadata when you're actually doing a recording. But I just want to reiterate, and I also wanted to share an example for you guys. It's very important to get as much information about the recording and its speakers as you can. So this means that you should get the location, the date, the speakers' names, the topic, etc. about the actual event. But then you should also get information about the speaker themselves, such as where they were born, what languages they speak, where their family members are from, what their job is, all sorts of questions about their lives that can be very relevant to how they speak. And this is useful so that future researchers can come in and they know exactly what the language is, what dialect they know about the person. Yeah, and I've included this link here. This is a metadata sheet that I really like to use. I'm constantly updating it, but I found this information is the most useful for me. So you're welcome to take a look at this, copy it, use it for yourselves. I find it to be a very good guide. So another important topic is ISO codes. And this is really important for file naming. Every file that you name should have an ISO code in it. And this is a 3-letter code that identifies your language. So nearly every language in the world has an ISO code. And this is important because some languages have the same name. And so you might look up your name and realize, oh wait, this isn't my language, this is a language in Africa, and I live in the Philippines, right? And so this is important for both you and for people who are accessing your data to know exactly what language you were working on, okay? So I've included a list of language codes here at Ethnologue. I will also add a different link in case you can't access Ethnologue, because there's sometimes a firewall and you might not be able to access it. So there's another website that I will add as a link after this presentation is over. Okay, take a look. And it's possible you might not find your language because not every language has an ISO code yet. And this is just because some people disagree. Sometimes it's considered a dialect and not a separate language. Or your language just hasn't been documented yet. And it's possible, if you see that your language doesn't have an ISO code, it's possible to ask to create one. It is a process, but it's worth it so that in the future you can use that ISO code to identify your language. All right, so let's take a look at file naming. File naming is super important, and you want to choose file names that are easy to understand but very informative, okay? And so I'm going to share with you the file naming system that I found to be very useful, and you can decide if you would like to use that file naming system or build upon it, okay? So a suggested file naming convention is having the date, so the year, then the month, then the day, the genre, so this could be story, this could be conversation, it could be interview. XY stands for a number, so if it's your first story, you write 01. If it's your 5th story, it's 05. And then your ISO code for your language, okay? And then at the end of every raw data file, you should have an O for original file, meaning that you haven't touched it yet, you haven't processed it. This is the file that came off of your audio recorder or video recorder. Okay, and then in this instance, ext simply refers to the extension. So is it a .wav file for an audio recording? Is it .mp4 for a video recording? JPEG for a picture? Okay, then there's this intermediate stage where you might be processing your data. Maybe you're transcribing it, or you're trimming it, using a different program to trim it or change the format. And in these cases, you want to save the data as something different. You want to add working at the end so that you know that this is the in-process data. And then the final step is getting rid of that O and having it ready to say, hey, this is done, this is ready to archive. Okay, so you can get rid of that O. Let's take a look at some examples because this might be really abstract. So pretend today I'm here in Hawaii, so I'm going to record a story in Hawaiian. I want to name my data so that I know that I recorded a story today. So first I have 2020 for the year, 02 for February, 24 for the day. Then I wrote story because I recorded a story, and it was my first story, so I have 01. And then at the end, I have HAW. This is the 3-letter ISO code for Hawaiian. Okay, so if you worked on a different language, if this was in English, it would be ENG. Right? So that's going to change based on your language. And this is a great way to do it because then all of your data is organized by date. And just looking at it, you know exactly what's inside. Yeah, you know if it's a story, you know if it's an interview, etc. Now, some archives, most archives will have a naming convention, so you might have to change your naming convention for the archive. And at this stage, this is where you would want to do that before you send your data to the archive. Okay, so this is not the file namings convention for Kaipuleo Hone. It's actually something different, but this is a more informative way of naming your files. Okay, so once you've renamed your files, it's really important to then fill in a metadata sheet. And each archive is going to have different information they want from you. I've linked here the metadata sheet for Kaipule-Ohone. Again, that's the archive on the UH campus, and we archive anything, that archive archives anything that LDTC works on. Okay, and so this metadata sheet looks like this. Right? It has a lot of information on top so that you don't get too lost. But generally, the kind of information it wants is the name of your file, what language is inside, so this is where you use the ISO code, the name of the speakers, where it was recorded, information about how long it is, and what format the recording is in. So all of these things are probably going to be necessary for most archives. Now, if you are interested, the sheet that I've shared with you also has this column that has YouTube video. So if you record something for this workshop and you would like us to archive it as well as put it on our YouTube channel, you can also include a title for your video. Okay, so as I said, you guys learned recording last week, and if you recorded something, this week is for practicing using these metadata, this flow, yeah? And if you haven't recorded something, go out and record something and practice using some sort of workflow like this. If you record something for while you're working on this workshop, you're very much welcome to share that video with us, and we can archive it in Kaipule-Ohone and in our Google and on our YouTube page. Okay, so if you're interested in that, you're welcome to follow this link here and upload your files to the Google Drive, and then we can process them from there. Okay, but if you choose to do this, make sure that you choose keep as a separate file, because sometimes your file namings will be the same, right? It's best to have your files with the same name. And so if you ever have a file that's the same name, keep it as a separate file so that it doesn't override the other one. Okay, so with that information, there should be this general workflow that you should follow with every recording that you make. The first step is to plan your recording. The second step is to write down all of the metadata. So that's the sheet that I shared with you at first that has the date and the speaker name and their family and where they were born, etc. Then you want to make the recording. And as soon as you've made the recording, or as soon as you've finished recording for the day, you want to move all that data to your computer. Once you've moved the data from your computer to your computer, you can rename the data using this file naming convention I gave you or a different one. After that, this is when you want to back up your data on an external hard drive. So before you even archive, it's really important to have 2 copies of your data on your computer, on a hard drive. If you have cloud services, you can also do that. Okay. Once you've backed up your data, you want to fill in the metadata sheet, and that is this one, the one that you're going to send to the archive, so that they know what's in each of the files. After that, then you'll process the data. You can trim it if you want. You can change the format. You can transcribe it, translate it, right? After you've taken care of backing up your data and naming it. Okay, then you want to back up your process data and rename the files. And then it's time to archive. Okay, and that's when you'll send your data to the archive that you've chosen. Okay, if you're interested, I know this is a very dry topic, but if you're interested in learning how to have better metadata and data management skills, I've linked to several papers that you can read here. You can just click on the link and the PDF will be there. These are just really important papers that talk about why it's important to archive your work, why it's important to have good data management skills. Okay, so take a look at those, especially if you're working on a documentation project right now. It might be really useful for you. All right, and so that is the end of this presentation. I will stick around for questions, discussion, but I do want to say before you guys send your questions in that next Monday on March 2nd, Greg von Diziano will be teaching morphology and syntax. Okay, so this is where you're going to learn how to analyze the structure and the words of all of the data that you've collected and transcribed. Okay, so thank you very much. Send in your experiences, send in your questions. I'm going to stick around and answer those for a little bit. That's the one I wanted to link to. I thought I changed it. Oh, well. I changed it like an half hour before. Hi Basil, great to see that you're here from Nigeria. Didn't see that earlier. All right, so it looks like Anna is asking if I could talk about why it's important to have good metadata. Why does it matter what age a speaker is or where they live? That's a really good question. And it can be useful for a lot of things. So firstly, it can be useful for you as the researcher. It's good to, at least for me, I remember faces, I remember experiences, and so remembering, it helps to remember where things were recorded and stuff like that. But aside from the personal reasons why it might be good to have these, it's also really important for future research. For example, where a speaker is from or where their parents are from might influence their speech. Okay, it could tell us what dialect someone speaks. It could tell us why maybe they speak a little different from other people in that region. Right? And so this information can be useful for people interested in sociolinguistics, interested in understanding the history or culture around the language, but also it can be really important for good linguistic analysis because you really want to know the background behind your speakers and you want to know what language or dialect you're actually looking at. All right, Wasim, any software for transcription and interpretation of text? Great question. Yes. The most commonly used software is called Elon, and I can link to that. I can link to that at the bottom of this video as soon as the video is over. Elon is a great tool for transcription and translation and annotation. You can really use it for any kind of data processing you need. It can be a little difficult to learn, but we'll be having a workshop later on that will help teach how to navigate Elon at first glance. Okay, so I'll link to that in the comments. It's also important to think about processing data. You might need to change the format for your archives. You might need to trim your data so that you can have audio and video in the same file. And if that's the case, there's a lot of free software for editing your videos and editing your audio. And I'll also link to those after the presentation is over. Some of these are Handbrake and HitFilm and MFmpeg, but I'll link to them so that you guys can check them out yourselves. Okay, Mercedes is asking how accessible these archives are for students and or speakers. It depends on the archive. Certain archives have stricter rules about who's able to deposit data in them than others. But for the most part, if you are documenting a language, an archive will want to archive your data, right? Because we have mutual goals to document the world's languages, yeah? And so if you reach out to an archive, and it's great to just ask and be like, hey, I have this data. Is it possible to archive with you? And you can work with the archive manager to decide if that's going to be possible. Yeah. Now, with the data that you archive, that is entirely up to you who has access to it. Okay, so you will have the choice, well, you and the speakers that you record will have the choice as to whether that data can be publicly available or if it should just be certain community members or if it's just the researcher or just the speakers. And so you definitely want to make sure whenever you're recording to communicate with your speakers if they're okay with everyone having access to these videos. And then whenever you do the archiving, you will have the choice to make this data open access, which means that anyone can access it. And as long as you share the links and stuff, everyone is able to access it and download that data. No, Wasim is asking, can we use Elon for interlinearization too? So I'm assuming you mean interlinear glossing, yeah, where you have each word and you break it up into morphemes and translate that word. And yes, you can. It is possible to use Elon for that. It can be a little complex. So I like to work with both Elon and Flex in terms of interlinear glossing. Yeah. And again, I will link to all of the different resources that I just mentioned at the end of this video with a description of what each of them is for. All right, I'll stick around for any other questions. Yeah, so Samuel said that you can also parse Elon into Flex for interlinear glossing. This is a really, really great way to do interlinear glossing, especially if you're using Flex for lexical management, right? Adding definitions and stuff like that. Flex is a really great tool to use to help with interlinear glossing because it autofills once you've already added the morpheme. Okay, so again, I'll link to Flex so that you guys can play around with it. Yeah, and Samuel's also saying you can import it into Prod.
Is Flex usable on all operating systems?
Greg is asking, is Flex usable on all operating systems? Flex is not, to my knowledge. I no longer have a Mac, but for the most part, if you have a Mac, you can't use Flex.
Unless you get Ubuntu.
Unless you get Ubuntu, which downloads Linux. But it's very complicated. Yeah, so it only really works Flex only really works if you have Windows operating system or Linux. Wasim is asking, is there any platform to learn these softwares? There's tools online to help you use a lot of these softwares, especially with video editing software. There's a lot of tools to help you be able to edit your audio and video. We will be giving you guys an introduction to Elon in a few weeks. So if you're interested in using Elon and figuring out how that works, stick around. In a few weeks, Olivia Bianchini will be walking you through that software. Flex has, to my knowledge, it has some resources that you can look up, but a lot of it you have to just kind of play with. Yeah. Although Flex is pretty intuitive, to my knowledge. Yeah.
Well, there's a good video series on Vimeo that introduces Flex.
Oh, great. Mm-hmm. Greg is saying that there's a great video series on Vimeo that introduces Flex.
And it's from the Summer Institute of Linguistics who runs that program.
Oh.
So it's from them teaching how to use it.
So it's from the Summer Institute of Linguistics, which is the organization that created and maintains that program. So whenever we link to Flex, we will also link to the videos so that you guys can use those to figure out how to use the program. Yeah. Any other questions? Awesome. I'll stick around for another minute or so if anyone has any other questions. Thank you very much for everyone joining. If you think of something and you want to ask them, my email is at the very beginning of this presentation. You're welcome to email me, or you can ask the question in the group, and someone will certainly have an email there, or certainly have an answer there. All right. Thank you so much. It's wonderful virtually meeting all of you. Good luck with all of your metadata management and archiving, and I hope it goes well. I'll see ya.